On our agenda is statement by the President of the European Council, conclusions of the European Council meeting 28th-29th of October, and economic governance. I'd like to welcome to the Chamber the President of the European Council, Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, and the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. We also have the Belgian presidency represented and a number of members of the College of Commissioners are with us. I'd like to open with the opening remarks by Herman Van Rompuy, President of the European Council.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, the European Council meeting of the 28th and 29th of October focused on the economic governance of our Union, in particular with the report of the Task Force on Economic Governance, the report of which it endorsed. Events since then, and I refer in particular to Ireland, have illustrated the importance of this subject in general and of the need for the rapidly deployable financial mechanism we decided on in May in particular. I pay tribute to the speed of the action of the finance ministers over the last week, and I underline that this illustrates the level of determination of all concerned to safeguard the stability of the euro. The EU and the euro area financial support will be provided under a strong policy programme which will be negotiated with the Irish authorities by the Commission and the IMF in liaison with the European Central Bank. And given the strong fundamentals of the Irish economy, decisive implementation of the programme should allow a return to a robust and sustainable growth, safeguarding the economic and social cohesion. I am now quoting the Eurogroup and the ECOFIN ministers. The task was not an intergovernmental conference, but it was a review, I am speaking on the task force, of our working methods, priorities and procedures in this field. We sought to get the right balance between, on the one hand, laying down an overall European framework regarding the need to avoid excessive fiscal deficit and economic imbalances inside the Union, and on the other hand, allowing national governments freely to choose what they want to tax and on what they want to spend, in accordance with their national political procedures and European law. We want to ensure that each member state fully takes into account the impact of its economic and fiscal decisions on its partners and on the stability of the European Union as a whole. At the same time, we want to strengthen the capacity of the Union level to react when policies in a member state present a risk to the rest of the Union. These recommendations, as the others of the task force, are also extremely close to the Commission proposals. I also discussed these issues twice with the group leaders in the European Parliament and with the chairs of the competent committees in accordance with the format you requested. One clarification. Some people claim to be disappointed there is not more automaticity in the decision making. Well, more automaticity is exactly what we propose. The Council, and it was the Council under the treaty, will decide on sanctions on the basis of a so-called reversed majority. This means a Commission proposal for sanctions stands unless a qualified majority vote against, whereas until now a majority had to approve the sanctions. Only a few weeks ago, some member states were very reluctant about the reversed majority. It really is a breakthrough. And furthermore, the task force proposed a whole series of other measures aimed at strengthening the Stability Pact, such as more policy coordination, the European semester, sound statistics and independent fiscal councils. Member states should feel that their policy decisions affect all their partners and the Union as a whole. It is the big lesson of the crisis. A general remark. The task force was a political framework aimed at rapidly generating consensus. All the breakthroughs we achieved now need to be translated into legislative texts. The work needs to be done by the Commission, the Council and the Parliament. I trust all the institutions will keep up the momentum. It is a vital responsibility. Now the third and final main element of the task force, which also brings me to the follow-up of the task force. We recommend a robust and credible permanent crisis mechanism to safeguard the financial stability of the euro area as a whole. All the heads of state and government agreed on that need and on the fact that it requires a limited treaty change. Before concluding on this point, I would like to underline that the work on the Stability Pact is not simply about being punitive to Member States or about rectifying past mistakes. It is important to look at it in a wider context. We must not lose sight of the wider challenge of improving Europe's structural and sustainable growth rates and its general economic performance. This was the focus of the EU 2020 strategy agreed by the European Council earlier this year. The answer to those who fear that fiscal retrenchment will cut economic growth rates is to focus better on the underlying structural factors that hinder our economic performance and to remedy them. That will be the main objective of the European Council meetings of February and March next year. Dear colleagues, the European Council also had a brief discussion on EU budgetary matters, stimulated among others by the speech of your President at the opening of our meeting. We agreed to return to this in December. In the meantime, our conclusions simply said, and I quote, "It is essential that the European Union budget and the forthcoming multi-annual financial framework reflect the consolidation efforts being made by Member States to bring deficit and debt into a more sustainable path. Respecting, and I am stressing this, respecting the role of the different institutions and the need to meet Europe's objectives, the European Council will discuss at its next meeting how to ensure that spending at the European level can make an appropriate contribution to this work." Unquote. Let me reassure you that we acknowledge the new role of the Parliament in line with the Lisbon Treaty. We of course did not take a position as European Council on the 2011 budgetary procedure, which is a matter for the Council of Ministers and the Parliament. As President of the European Council, I appeal to all parties concerned to continue their consultations in order to reach a compromise on the 2011 budget with the shortest delay possible. In a compromise, the various concerns have to be taken on board, while of course respecting the treaties. Dear colleagues, this European Council also served, as will be the case for all European Councils, to prepare common positions for the European Union ahead of major international events. In this case, our attention focused on the preparation of the G20, the Cancun Climate Change Conference and a number of bilateral summits. On the G20, which has of course now taken place, we agreed on the priorities which were then promoted by the representatives of the Union and by the EU Member States, which are members of the G20. These included securing approval of the Basel III Accords on capital requirements and on the reform of the IMF. Concerning the latter, I would like to emphasise that this landmark reform was made possible by the open and constructive approach by the Europeans. We gave up 2 seats in order to reach the final agreement, thus bearing a large part of the adjustment effort. And concerning the question of imbalances in the global economy and exchange rate policy, discussions were tense in the run-up to the G20 meeting. The summit made the right analysis and agreed on a process, and we welcome the decisions to establish a set of indicators on imbalances and the assessment that will be made in 2011. What is now crucial is to agree on policy conclusions and, if need be, corrective action on the basis of this assessment. On Cancun, the European Council also prepared the EU position for the negotiations starting at the end of this month. Since Copenhagen last year, numerous talks have taken place, formal or informal, but they are slow and remain very difficult. Cancun will probably only be an intermediate step towards a global framework on tackling climate change. The European Union regrets this, of course. Finally, our bilateral summits. The European Council discussed our priorities and strategies for the forthcoming summits, namely those with the United States, Russia, Ukraine, India and Africa. This is extremely useful for President Barroso and myself and ensures that on such occasions we are speaking not just for the Brussels institutions but for the 27 as a whole. I intend to make it a regular feature of the European Council meetings. Dear colleagues, that concludes my summary of the most recent meeting of the European Council, which took place nearly a month ago. I will in any case continue my practice of briefing the leaders of your political groups immediately within a couple of hours after the end of each European Council meeting, and I am looking forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your speech. Now I would like to ask Mr. President José Manuel Barroso to take the floor.
President, honourable members, if a week is a long time in politics, a month can seem an eternity. A lot has happened since the last European Council, not least the recent events in Ireland. The action intended is a further crucial step to safeguard the financial stability of Ireland, the euro area and the European Union as a whole. The two instruments we set up in May are effective tools that can do the job they are designed to do. Ireland has very specific issues to address, and these instruments are able to respond to that. This intervention should now allow the Irish economy to get back on the path to sustainable growth, drawing on its fundamental strengths. President, honourable members, the past few months have been a challenge. We have come a very long way, but the work is not yet complete. Our economic governance is being transformed. The task force chaired by President Van Rompuy has presented its results, which are very positive. Benefiting from significant inputs from the Commission, it has managed to achieve broad convergence on the Commission's legislative proposals and also covered some other very important aspects of economic governance. Crucially, stricter fiscal rules and broader economic surveillance, both cornerstones of the Commission package, have been preserved. I have stressed many times before the importance of having the new framework operational as soon as possible. So I was pleased that the European Council backed our idea for a fast-track approach and set itself the objective of agreement on the Commission's legislative proposals by summer 2011. It is notable that the questions voiced last September about the Commission putting legislative proposals on the table have now turned into a desire to fast-track those proposals. Now, the normal legislative procedure must run its course over the coming months. I count on the Community method to work as well as it has always done and help us strengthen economic governance in the euro area and in Europe. It is my belief that we will end up with tough rules based on adequate incentives for compliance, semi-automatic implementation and an effective framework to deal with broader macroeconomic imbalances. We need reinforced and rigorous economic governance to achieve stable and sustainable growth, which is critical for the employment and welfare of our citizens. Honourable members, a permanent crisis resolution mechanism for the euro area is an essential piece of this jigsaw. The temporary mechanism currently in force will expire in 2014, so it is vital that something credible, robust, lasting and grounded in the essential technical realities is put in place by then. That is why the Commission has already started its preparatory work on the general features of a future new mechanism for the euro area. This mechanism, which we are preparing in close consultation with the President of the European Council, should be seen in the context of the overall effort to reinforce economic governance in the European Union and the euro area. So I would like to make clear that even if the mechanism is funded from national budgets, it will remain a European initiative and will of course be able to draw on expertise, independence and impartiality of the Commission to make it function. The mechanism will have three main components: a macroeconomic adjustment programme, a financing arrangement and private sector involvement. The latter can take many forms, but first and foremost I want to make clear that whatever is decided on private sector involvement, it will only apply after 2013. The heads of state and government decided unanimously that treaty change is required to establish this mechanism. When we concluded the Lisbon Treaty last year, nobody imagined someone would be proposing huge changes so soon. We all know that this is never an easy process and we all understand the risks. That is one of the reasons why I explained during the European Council and even before that we should not accept a revision of the treaty that calls into question the voting rights of member states. I am happy that this argument was accepted and that any revision will be a limited, indeed a surgical one. It also makes sense for us to have as straightforward a process as possible. That is why I would caution against the temptation to start linking this to other unconnected subjects. Honourable members, all this action is not taking place in a vacuum. The European Council, the G20 summit, the EU-US summit in Lisbon last weekend, all are staging posts, part of our larger plan to restore Europe to stability and growth. We will speak about the G20 summit in the next debate in this House, so let me for now concentrate very briefly on the very important EU-US summit in Lisbon. The atmosphere at the summit was intimate, friendly and focused. Together with President Van Rompuy, we agreed with President Obama on the need for a transatlantic agenda for growth and jobs, including regulatory convergence and early consultations on issues like competitiveness and global reform. We have tasked the ministers and commissioners with moving this concrete work forward, notably through the Transatlantic Economic Forum. The global economy, G20 and emerging economies were also very much on the agenda. And my point is this: the European Union will only be able to achieve its objectives if we activate all policy areas, if we capitalise on the relationship we have with all our key partners, if we use the leverage available to us in an integrated way at all levels, at the national, European, global level. One thing is clear: we will have more influence on the outside if we are capable of reaching agreement among ourselves within the European Union. And in this respect, I am concerned that some of the more recent positioning has not contributed to the focus and coherence of our joint action. I think the progress that we have achieved so far on economic governance is an indication that we can, with sufficient political will on all sides, make Europe a stronger force in the world for the benefit of our citizens. But for this, let's be clear, we need a political will. We need a sense of common purpose, not only from the European institutions, from all our member states. And that's an appeal I want to make today: more coherence, more convergence, more common purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. On behalf of the political groups, Mr. President Joseph Daul, EPP.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
President, colleagues, a survey I saw yesterday in a newspaper says that 70% of all French people say that they are faced with the crisis still. It's not been settled, and I'm sure that a broader survey conducted in Europe would provide the same results. Thus, we need to address the legitimate concerns of our citizens who are living through difficult times and are impatient when they see how long and complex decision-taking procedures are in Europe and globally. Many of the people who speak to me say, "What are you doing? What's Europe doing for me, for my family?" People are afraid, but at the same time I see that increasingly more and more politicians, more and more countries through to this hemicycle are using, manipulating and exploiting this fear, this concern, and have no proposals. These populist ideas, I think, are very serious, and I will stress here that this is not the way we are going to settle these serious problems of our countries, for Europe and throughout the world. It's up to the political parties and the groups to reject this demagogy, this populism, and get their voices more broadly heard. The solution to the crisis is not in protectionism, looking inwards. There are no easy, rapid solutions to the crisis before us. No, it's not possible to turn our backs on solidarity and efforts to make Europe, therefore all of our countries, stronger in globalization. We have to realize that finally we need our partners in difficult times. We need to learn from what's happening in Ireland. I'm not pointing the finger at Ireland, President of the Council and the Commission, but we have to learn the lessons. Because the difficulties faced by Ireland are not only due to their banks, but also due to the economic and fiscal policy of the current government, and that for many years. The Celtic Tiger, which built its growth alone with atypical taxation, minimum banking regulations, and investment levels unequaled anywhere else in Europe, is now seeing the real estate bubble collapsing, high levels, massive record levels of unemployment as well. The Irish government guaranteed the entire banking system a commitment of huge amounts of money, 3 times its GNP, which led to a 32% public deficit. And it is now demanding and correctly being given European solidarity. I'm happy to see that. And as Commissioner Olli Rehn said here on Monday, really, Ireland will be supported and will ensure the stability of the Eurozone, but that European stability being extended now, as when it joined the Union, we have to ensure that the Irish government has established itself over many years as well. Many governments have tried to address their fiscality, but we need good governance within the euro. And every time, certain countries, always the same ones, have stood out against this. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone, but I feel it's time that we learnt from past behaviour for the future. I've said on various occasions here, a crisis is an opportunity for change, and we should not be frightened of changing certain of our habits which have not produced the expected positive results. Colleagues, the approach adopted by the European Council some weeks ago and the G20 approach in Seoul are moving in the right direction, but not going far enough. So we need to awaken to the need to work together within Europe and between major regional blocs in order to address the instability of our financial markets, the imbalance in commercial exchange, and also to avoid an exchange war. We all know that for all of these subjects, only our countries can find a viable long-term solution to the expectations of 500 million Europeans who, as I said when I began, expect from all of us here, their political leaders and in our capitals, they expect forward-looking solutions. President of the Council, if the crisis has taught us something, it's that solutions for yesterday may not apply to tomorrow. We really have to act, but we're going to pay an even higher price if we continue to ignore the situation. So I would call on the European institutions, on the governments of our member states to change, to draw the political lessons from this crisis and to no longer think of solidarity when their house is burning. One final point, President. It's not a question of a fight between the Council and the Parliament. It's a question of implementing the treaties. It boils down to solidarity, working hand in hand, and that's the message I am putting across to you so that we can emerge from this crisis to the benefit of our citizens. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. President Martin Schulz, Socialists and Democrats.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Listening to the President of the European Council and listening to the President of the Commission were two different experiences. Mr. Van Rompuy gave us a report according to which everything seems to be hunky-dory. Listening to Mr. Barroso, on the other hand, Some of the contributions we've heard over the last weeks have not helped obtain consistency. That's what Mr. Barroso said about Council. That something doesn't add up. The reality in Europe is different. The EU is falling apart into three elements: France and Germany, the rest of the Eurozone, and then the non-Eurozone, centered around a special position of the United Kingdom. And the special position of the United Kingdom needs looking at. Merkel and Sarkozy have done a deal with Cameron. Everybody knows that, and it has to be said openly. According to the deal, there needs to be a treaty change for the Stability Pact. Cameron says yes, okay, although the House of Commons doesn't want it, but in return Cameron gets the budget he wants. And Sarkozy and Merkel have agreed. That's the reality of Europe. That's not only nothing to do with the community spirit, it's actually tearing the European Union apart. In the long run, it will tear the European Union apart. And there are those who want that. They applaud. Well, there they are, over there. If you don't want those people over there to call the shots in Europe in the future, then you have to take Europe in another direction. We can live with those four, says Mrs. Harms, off microphone. I'll try to continue as best I can, despite the interruption, says Mr. Schulz. The reform of the Stability Pact depends on the consent of a country that isn't even in the Eurozone. Mrs. Merkel wants a revision of the treaties at a time when nobody in this House can tell what's happening in Ireland. And I'm not sure that a treaty change in Ireland would go through as smoothly as Mr. Van Rompuy's report on the state of the European Union. Mrs. Merkel says the private sector has to be involved. I have a question to you, Mr. Rehn, about the private sector in Ireland. How on earth did the Irish banks pass a stress test? Could you explain that to us? Ladies and gentlemen, what Mrs. Merkel is doing is a stress test for the euro. I'll explain to you what's going on. Private sector participation is good. In the European Parliament, we wanted private sector participation in the form of a financial transaction tax. That was the EP position, and it remains my position. It was mentioned in a footnote at the G8 summit. They decided they didn't want that, but they decided to leave it for the coffee break. Were the private sector to be involved, were the private sector have to pay, that would be the way to do it. But apparently the UK doesn't want it. So does the UK decide everything that happens in the European Union? Let's start with the financial transaction tax in the Eurozone. Let's say that that's how the private sector can participate. Yes, I won't be long, Mr. President. Please, I don't have very much speaking time, but I just have one more point to make.
Yeah.
I don't know if people heard that. A nation, an empire, a Führer. That's what that man over there said. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer were his exact words.
President, well, time is over. Please finish your last remarks. Last remarks. Yeah.
Herr Präsident.
Mr. President, I won't be long. When a man like that traipses through this chamber chanting Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, There were people in Germany who said that, and I fight that spirit in everything I do, but I'm not sure he does.
President, I cannot accept what you have just said, sir. We are in a democracy. This is a democratic era, and I would ask you to apologize. I would ask you to make an official apology. Otherwise, we are going to lodge a complaint. You know, there are people who have said less than that, and I'm sorry, this is not acceptable.
Thank you.
Non, 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 non. C'est tout juste, c'est tout juste.
You know, I'm always surprised you didn't add and will add concentration camps to the equation. Settle the problem that way.
Dear colleagues, we must go ahead. I will, moment. I will take it into account. I will take it into account. I will read you. I will take it into account. The President shall call to order any member who disrupts the smooth conduct of the proceedings or whose conduct fails to comply with the relevant provisions of Rule 9. So I will ask you, colleague, to apologize the Chamber.
Views expressed by Herr Schulz meet the case. He is an undemocratic fascist.
Colleagues, we expected something quite different, because we wouldn't like our discussion to be disturbed in such a way. So I will call you, colleague, to the meeting with me, and we must take decision for the next steps. Thank you. Sorry. Sorry? Oh, it is impossible to keep our discussion in such an atmosphere. Well, is it possible here? Colleague, as you see, the Chamber is protesting very deeply against your behavior. And, can I give you? So, it is Article number 152, point number 3. I will read it. I will read it in my mother tongue. W przypadku zakłócania porządku lub kolejnego naruszenia.
In the case of business being disrupted by a member, the member can be deprived of the floor and removed from the chamber. Should the disturbance continue, if a further offence is committed, the offender may be denied the right to speak and be excluded from the chamber. The Secretary-General shall without delay see to it that disciplinary measures are carried out with the assistance of the ushers and, if necessary, of Parliament's security service. As you know, most of the members in the chamber cannot accept your behaviour. I would therefore ask you to leave the chamber at this point.
Koleżanki I koledzy,
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen,
you can discuss and you can express your opinion, but not to disturb each other, because we cannot keep order in our chamber. The next speaker, Mr. President Guy Verhofstadt, Liberals and Democrats. The President, the floor is yours.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, tout d'abord.
Thank you, President. Well, first of all, let me say that what has just happened here is very serious indeed. I think political groups should react today. We should have a joint position on this in response to what's happened, and I very much hope that all groups will be very clear on this vis-à-vis the member concerned, and we will certainly support you, the measure you've just taken, and certainly this should not happen again.
Je crois que
Mr. Daul's comments earlier on Ireland, if I may refer to that, he carried out an analysis which focused on Ireland, and he's right in what he says, but let me say this to you, Joseph. At the beginning of the financial crisis, Joseph, if then we'd established a European rescue plan for banks in October 2008, because that is what the Commission had suggested, but the Member States refused that idea. If we'd done that back then, we would never have had these problems that we're confronting in Ireland right now. In October 2008, it was dismissed. No, there's no need to do this. We're not going to do this. You know, we in Germany, for instance, we have enough money to settle our own problems. We're not going to do it. Well, look at the results. You can see them for yourselves. Secondly, the problem right now, obviously tension still prevails. I very much hope that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow the euro will be stable again, but that's not, you know, that's for the future. That's not the case today. We have to look at the real situation as it is today, and therefore we must pay heed to what was said yesterday by the President of the European Central Bank together with Mr. Rehn. There was a debate yesterday. We should listen carefully to what was said. Not many people were in the chamber for the debate, but what Mr. Trichet said was really important. He said that the package in itself is not enough to reintroduce stability into the Eurozone. And we therefore have particular responsibility in this Parliament. After all, we are co-deciders in all of these areas. So what we need to do is take this very seriously. What is the real issue? What is the real problem? You don't have a currency anywhere in the world, a currency that would not be supported by a government, by a unique economic policy, by a strategy and by a single shares market. You don't have this anywhere else in the world. Here in the Eurozone, we think that we can do this with 16 governments, with 16 bond markets, with 16 different economic policies, and so on and so forth. So that's where we have a role to play, I believe, and that is the kind of conclusion that we should be drawing, namely that we should go beyond Council's decisions. In fact, Mr. Rehn, I would say that we should almost go beyond the Commission's proposals, and I think we should back Mr. Trichet. Mr. Trichet is right. After all, Mr. Trichet is responsible for the stability of the euro, and he's asking the Parliament and he's asking the other European institutions to please strengthen our system. That's the only decision we can take, to strengthen things, to put this on a community basis and to make sure that sanctions are indeed automatic, because they're not for the time being. We want to create a euro bond market. You know, Greece and Germany, of course, differences will not disappear, or Ireland and Germany. Nothing will be resolved if we don't have a single bond market. And another sanction that would be really efficient for these countries. I think it would be a good idea because they're not applying the Stability Pact. Finally, by way of a conclusion, we need genuine economic governance, one that really stimulates investment. If the Germans are calling for this, and if the German government is calling for this, is calling for a change in order to allow that to happen, Article 136 of the treaty, to rely on that, well, fine, let's go ahead with that. Let's do that, but let's also do what is necessary, namely to introduce in Article 136 for the future real economic governance, real automatic sanctions. It's going to be a treaty change. It's, you know, on our doorstep. Let's turn it into an opportunity to do what we need to do for the euro, for the future. What we need is, of course, economic governance within the Eurozone and the European Union. Thank you.
Mr. President, the next speaker on behalf of the Greens. Oh, sorry, it's a blue card. Mr. President Verhofstadt, are you ready to answer with the question? Are you ready to answer with the question? Yes, please, sorry. Mr. Dartmouth, blue card.
In the event that the Commission gets the economic governance which it is seeking and which you are seeking for it, is it then your contention that the Commission would always make the right decisions?
Oh, I think I have more confidence in the meaning of the European Commission to take measures against the countries that don't apply the Stability Pact than in the Council itself, where the people of the Council are, where the chief of the governments are. I have been 9 years in the Council, and I have never seen a country pointing the finger to another country and saying, you don't apply the Stability Pact. We have seen it in 2004 and 2005 with France and Germany. They didn't apply the Stability Pact and there was no sanction against both countries. And that's the reason why the European Commission, who is the communitarian institution and who is really the method of Monnet and Schuman, has to be in the lead of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Madlener, point of order, I understand.
Ja, voorzitter, dat klopt. Ik kon er net even niet tussenkomen.
President, I wasn't able to intervene when you threw out our colleague from UKIP, but I would like to protest nonetheless against the way the rules have been applied. I think that in the past Mr. Schulz called a colleague a fascist, but there were no sanctions applied to him. But what...
You do not have the floor. If you have a problem, then please come to see me and we'll talk about it together.
As you know, I asked you also to discuss some points, very important, personal. It was my personal invitation for you. And I expressed you my point of view, and you knew everything about my point of view. And from this point of view, I also ask you, colleague, if you have any doubt of my decision. And the next speaker, on behalf of the Greens, Madame Rebecca Harms, co-president, please.
Herr Präsident, meine Damen und Herren.
President, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, it's rather difficult in this rather tense atmosphere to speak. You know, I think it's an expression of the situation in which the European Union could find itself if we don't step more carefully and shape a more decisive European policy. Because, Martin Schulz, I don't feel that it's these small changes to the treaty that Germany wants and needs, because it's not a natural catastrophe we're facing in this financial crisis. That's not the problem. The problem is that the European Council, the representatives of the bigger countries in the Council, are no longer in a position to ensure within this crisis that some sort of positive spark can come out of all this and really move through into the communities, the people in our member states. You know, this pro-European spirit has been lost so quickly, and I find that so strange, so bizarre that Germany, a country which drew so strongly on solidarity in its past history, but now in its modern history is no longer in a position in this debate which is marked by narrow-mindedness, I think. It's no longer able to move into a discussion about the question of how important it is for the member states that they've linked their fates so closely together, and that Mr. Van Rompuy, the Council, is no longer in a position to really support the peoples of Europe who are so worried, as Joseph Daul was saying, why they can't explain that it's only possible for us to stand together to come out of this crisis rather than pulling away from each other. This complete lack of this spirit, I think, is a problem before us. And secondly, we don't have an honest political explanation of the fact that, well, for every Greek person, every Irish person, we're going to save them, but you know, we are saving our countries. That the Irish situation is not an Irish emergency situation alone. It's also an emergency for Germany and for the UK, even if you don't like to hear that. And I think that that honest declaration, the lack of it, I think, is the reason why our citizens are finding it difficult to go along with what's being decided at this current moment. And Mr. Verhofstadt is absolutely right. Economic governance really is what must now take shape. We all know that. The Council, the Commission, they can declare and must declare that as quickly as possible they really will take all necessary steps. But as they say that, that's when the alarm bells ring in my mind, because, as I say, this pro-European spirit of solidarity is lacking. And that's why we don't have these necessary steps towards pulling together. We've been talking about tax dumping in Ireland. That has to change. But there's the other question as well, you know, that's one question. When and how is another question. But altogether, our member states, I think, have to start to bring their tax policies closer together, because otherwise we're going to have a very tricky times ahead of us in the European Union. But we shouldn't take one point too easily either. It's important. You know, we have to restructure our debts. We have to get all creditors involved as well, and place blame on those who've really caused the crisis. Quite honestly, it's very difficult for me to judge what's right and wrong in all of this. We know that Spain and Portugal are targeted. It's just a matter of time, basically, until a call for crisis management and solidarity comes from there as well. Now, if we bring the creditors in right now or not, or whether it's better to say right here and now, we want economic governance, we want strict regulation of the banking sector, is a question. The question of the financial transaction tax and tax on people who are making profits from this crisis. We need to do something about this, and thank you very much indeed.
Madam Kay Swinburne, Conservatives and Reformists.
Thank you, Mr. President. For once, the two main topics being discussed by the European Council and the media back in my Welsh constituency are one and the same. Firstly, how will the EU cope with the situation in Ireland? And secondly, how do you resolve the impasse of the EU budget? In Wales, we fully appreciate the EU funds received, and all my constituents do appreciate the need for a stable Eurozone. However, the difference between the way the two topics are discussed in Cardiff and in Brussels are pronounced. In Brussels, within the European Parliament, we take the two issues and discuss them separately. The European Parliament's response, and that of the Council to save the euro, is that we need improved economic governance, more rules for national governments, and enforcement via fines and sanctions. While for the budget we conclude that there is a need for Member States to stop being selfish and put more Europe over the needs of their own countries. In Cardiff, my capital city, and I'm sure in Dublin, it all comes back to how and where should taxpayers' money be spent. People know that austerity packages are necessary. They are told just how indebted their countries are every day. They know tough decisions have to be made, but they also want to decide how their hard-earned money gets spent. Being asked to give up even more money to EU projects, funding through an increased EU budget, at a time when they're being asked to give up a slice of their public sector pensions, or even in some cases basic welfare provisions that they have come to depend on, is for many constituents a step too far. When the EU itself recognises that it hasn't done a good enough job at enforcing its own rules and standards within the Eurozone, it hardly gives citizens much incentive to give it even more money. During these times of strict public spending, and as we review rules on economic governance for Member States, we within the European Parliament need to respect the pressures that Member States are under and accept that all non-urgent projects of EU institutions should be deferred to allow the setting of an EU budget that reflects our troubled economic times. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your speech. Are you ready to answer the question on the rule of blue card? Yeah? Yes, please.
Does the Speaker appreciate that the so-called EU funds, which the Speaker referred to as having been received by the Speaker's constituents, are simply the UK's own money being returned, but being returned only in part, and after the European Union has skimmed off its croupier's turn? Does the lady appreciate or understand that?
As the gentleman knows, I fully appreciate where the money comes from and who the net payers are to the EU budget. However, my constituents in Wales just see that they get investment in crucial projects when they actually have a GDP less than any other region in the UK. And so I will defend the EU spend in my constituency every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. President Lothar Bisky, United Left.
Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Mr. President. When the heads of state and government come up with a way of safeguarding financial stability in the Eurozone, I'll certainly welcome that. The Van Rompuy task force on economic governance worked for many months, but the result leaves a great deal to be desired. Apparently, long-term deficits should be rolled back through budget surveillance. However, there are to be massive cuts in public budgets. I think that's both counterproductive and absurd. The Stability and Growth Pact has clearly not worked. Massively indebted countries cannot be punished further. The Stability and Growth Pact would then destroy solidarity between Eurozone states. This can only lead to ordinary people paying the price of the crisis through wage dumping and growing unemployment. This is going to make the situation worse for the countries hardest hit and will make their recovery slower. There is no point ratcheting up the pressure on countries like Ireland and Portugal and Greece. It is the economic imbalances in Europe which should be eliminated, and that means economic governance. We want a social Europe, a fair Europe, built upon the principle of solidarity. Politics must maintain or have restored primacy over economics.
Mr. Co-President Nigel FARAGE, Freedom and Democracy.
Well, good morning, Mr. Van Rompuy. You've been in office for 1 year, and in that time the whole edifice is beginning to crumble. There's chaos. The money's running out. I should thank you. You should perhaps be the pin-up boy of the Eurosceptic movement. But just look around this chamber this morning. Just look at these faces. Look at the fear. Look at the anger. Poor old Barroso here looks like he's seen a ghost. You know, they're beginning to understand that the game is up. And yet, in their desperation to preserve their dream, they want to remove any remaining traces of democracy from the system. And it's pretty clear that none of you have learned anything. You know, when you yourself, Mr. Van Rompuy, say that the euro has brought us stability, I suppose I could applaud you for having a sense of humour, but isn't this really just the bunker mentality? You know, your fanaticism is out in the open. You talked about the fact that it was a lie to believe that the nation-state could exist in a 21st century globalised world. Well, that may be true in the case of Belgium, who haven't had a government for 6 months, but for the rest of us, right across every member state in this union, and perhaps this is why we see the fear in the faces, increasingly people are saying, we don't want that flag, we don't want the anthem, we don't want this political class, we want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history. And we had the Greek tragedy earlier on this year, and now we have the situation in Ireland. Now, I know that the stupidity and greed of Irish politicians has a lot to do with this. They should never ever have joined the euro. They suffered with low interest rates, a false boom and a massive bust. But look at your response to them. What they're being told, as their government's collapsing, is that it would be inappropriate for them to have a general election. In fact, Commissioner Rehn here said they had to agree their budget first before they'd be allowed to have a general election. Just who the hell do you think you people are? You are very, very dangerous people indeed. Your obsession with creating this Euro state means that you're happy to destroy democracy. You appear to be happy for millions and millions of people to be unemployed and to be poor. Untold millions must suffer so that your Euro dream can continue. Well, it won't work, because it's Portugal next. With their debt levels of 325% of GDP, they're the next ones on the list, and after that, I suspect it'll be Spain. And the bailout for Spain would be 7 times the size of Ireland, and at that moment, all of the bailout money has gone. There won't be any more. But it's even more serious than economics, because if you rob people of their identity, if you rob them of their democracy, then all they are left with is nationalism and violence. I can only hope and pray that the Euro project is destroyed by the markets before that really happens.
Thank you. The next speaker, Madame Angelika WERTHMANN.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, the financial crisis. If we want to overcome it, we need to make serious changes to financial responsibility in Europe. We need better discipline, we need to supervise our financial policy, and we need to coordinate our crisis management efforts. Strengthening our Stability and Growth Pact would lead to greater responsibility in economic terms. We need step-by-step sanctions, and I think that they should be implemented early on in the process in order to deal with deficits and public debt. At the end of the day, a new crisis mechanism would mean that banks and insurance companies will have to shoulder their responsibilities. I would like to call for these measures because we need to show greater responsibility vis-à-vis our taxpayers. A comment on Cancun. The EU wants to speak with one voice. These are difficult times. I think it's an opportunity for us to say something about renewable energies and energy efficiency, and to look at the environment as a growth issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your speech. Other speakers on the list. Madame Marianne Thyssen, 2 minutes, please.
Dank u, voorzitter. Heren voorzitters, collega's.
Thank you, President. President, colleagues, the banking crisis, the economic crisis, the public finances crisis, we've seen them all over the last few years, and we've seen what a crisis can be. But I think that the public authorities have correctly reacted, particularly in Europe, by guaranteeing that the euro can resist, and the specific steps taken by the ECB, I think, have strengthened our position, and it's allowed us to see that solidarity can work. The current situation, though, shows that structural adaptation has to be continued, and that we must now move towards economic governance. The euro helped us, I would say, Mr. President, so let's use it now to help kick off with Europe again. We need robust rules, lasting mechanisms for debt, public debt, and in terms of our macroeconomy. We need them in order to re-establish confidence and to underscore economic growth, to create jobs and well-being. I hope that no one will be afraid of strict measures. The fear of being picked out by the European Union to be the scapegoat shouldn't make anyone afraid, but we have no choice in any case, Mr. President. We have to act. Mr. Rompuy, we've read your conclusions. It's a reflection of the task force, and I think it's true to say that we are now moving towards the economic adaptation we need. But allow me 2 questions. Firstly, more than half of the economic governance package will be on the basis of co-decision, and you're asking for the fast track procedure. So I was just wondering whether you're leaving enough leeway for negotiations with the Parliament so it can play its full role. And finally, the European Council doesn't want an automatic sanctions mechanism. We don't want to open up Pandora's box, reform the treaty, but nonetheless you are proposing a standing crisis mechanism to be set up with slight amendments. So where is Pandora and where is the box? Thank you.
Merci. Our next speaker is Stephen Hughes, and he has 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, President. I'm sure one thing we can all agree on is that heads of state and government are extremely busy men and women. I find it extremely puzzling, therefore, that they come together every 3 months or so and waste a tremendous amount of time and money to decide very little in the face of a crisis that is double underlined by what's just happened in Ireland. Just look at the idea of a financial transaction tax. It was on the agenda of the March summit, the June summit, the October summit, with each summit, with each council batting it on to the next council. It's now been batted on to the December council, and presumably beyond that, way on into the future. We urgently need a leap forward in economic governance. We need vision and action, mutual solidarity and close coordination. But instead, all we're getting is confusion, hesitation, mutual mistrust, which leads to permanent instability instead of stability. Some things are clear. First, a further tightening of the Stability and Growth Pact will not be enough. Worse still, there's a considerable danger that the new system as proposed will end up being pro-cyclical and therefore counterproductive for growth and jobs. Second, economic and monetary union needs to be made far more effective through truly balanced and effective economic policy coordination, not just surveillance and sanctioning. And third, in one way or another, there needs to be a system of common debt management for at least a share of public debt, maybe up to 60% of GDP. The economic benefits of such a system of Eurobonds are huge and clear. President Van Rompuy, you're on record as having said that you're not fond of politicians with a vision. Well, I think you prefer practical action, I understand that, but I think you can now begin to move to bring the two together. I hope the path is clear. An FTT, a balanced system of economic policy coordination, are beyond mere surveillance, and a common debt management. I think it's time, President Van Rompuy, for vision and action.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Unser nächster Redner ist Herr Lambsdorff. 1 Minute, bitte.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think one thing which is important, which people need to understand, is that the European Union is not in debt. We're talking about a debt crisis in the member states. The European Union, I think, is the only political entity in Europe which doesn't have any debts, and I hope it stays that way. We have a shared destiny in the Eurozone, and I think Mrs. Harms and Mr. Verhofstadt were right, that the community spirit has gone. Deauville was a mistake. Now France and Germany have taken over the intergovernmental approach, and the finance ministers now have the upper hand, yet they're the source of the problem. Economic governance, what does that mean? Do we want the European Union going into the details of our labour market and social policy? I think there's a big question mark surrounding that. I think stimulating growth, that's all very well, but first and foremost we need the public finances of the member states to be in order. That's the challenge, and that's why the European semester is so important and needs to be put into practice.
Blaue Karte.
Blue card.
Graf Lambsdorff.
Mr. Graf Lambsdorff, you're a member of the national leadership of the FDP. You're saying Deauville was a mistake. Does your party leader think Deauville was a mistake? He's also a deputy chancellor. Were you expecting a private opinion, or is that a party opinion? Are you ready to answer? Yes, of course I'm ready to answer. Martin Schulz is a member of the national leadership of the SPD in Germany, and from time to time he says things which are not fully in line with what his party thinks. Perhaps Mr. Schulz could tell me who from the FDP was in Deauville. We expressed our opinion fairly clearly on what happened there. I think the crucial issue is what happens preventively. If we get a treaty change, then that will resolve the problem, but Deauville was a mistake. Are you happy with that?
We move on to the next speaker, and that's Mr. Lamberts. Thank you very much, President. In too many member states, these last 25 years, we've seen a development based on debt, private and public debt. And the problem was that it was all financed through consumption and through financial speculation rather than investment. At the very same time, China, India were starting to invest. In our history books, maybe one day we'll be told that this was the moment when Europe lost its way. We of course need robust economic governance in Europe, but I think first of all we have to look at the results of this debt and put out the fire that has been caused by this. We cannot ignore reality. We will not be able to overcome this crisis if we don't restructure and if we don't rescale our debt. We need to make sure that we really take into account the real capacity to reimburse by our debtors. We have to be clear about this. You've got creditors and debtors, and both are responsible for the accumulation of debt. Some have borrowed over their means, but others have been irresponsible in their actions. They thought that they could make profit, substantial profit, without risk because they thought the taxpayer would always be there to bail them out. That's irresponsible. So both have to make an effort, both sides. If we fail to do that, then I think we will actually be faced with a kind of Japanese scenario, namely a kind of decline for the European Union. The citizens on our continent deserve far better than that, I believe. Thank you.
I see. Our next speaker is Madame Ford. For 1 minute, please.
Thank you. This is a debate about economic governance. Across Europe, many countries, including my own, face difficult economic times. And this weekend, the EU and the UK extended support to our friends across the Irish Sea. This is not a time for the European Parliament to indulge in name-calling or finger-pointing, but it is a time for learning from our mistakes and making better decisions in the future. Last week, in the middle of November, Greece amended its December year-end accounts for the third time. I hope we've finally drawn a line under those accounts. If there was ever a good reason for countries to ensure better accounting and forecasting, that was it. The European Council has gone a long way in their detailed plans for sharing of information during the European semester. It needs to be put into practice. Yes, we should share good practice between different countries, but also recognise that not all countries are the same, and good economic governance can be achieved in different ways, but for the benefit of all.
Thank you. I give the floor now to Madame de Brún for 1 minute.
Thank you. With the IMF, the ECB and the Commission coming in with very tough conditions, it's clear that billions of euro of cuts will be brought in Ireland. Jobs will be lost, there will be a significant reduction in public services, income tax will be raised for low earners. The banks will retain their profits, and it is the poor, the sick, the pensioners and other vulnerable groups that will bear the brunt of these austerity cuts. This is not help coming from Europe, and therefore we will strongly oppose it. Instead of seeking a mandate to bring these savage cuts in, now that the IMF and the EU have gone through their accounts, the government decided that there will not be an election until the budget has already been enacted. There was another path, and the Irish government chose not to take that path. They chose to act for the good of their friends in the banks and not for the good of the ordinary Irish people.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Senor Borghezio. Prego.
Il Comitato di Pietra di...
Well, basically, it's Mr. Trichet, the president of the central bank, who's the cornerstone of all of this. If we're back in Roman times, people would stand up in their togas and turn round and ask him about this situation and talk about how our patience is being tried. Why? We have to ask why. Are we moving in the right direction now? Difficult decisions have been taken on the Europe, or are we going to decide that saving the euro is going to bring about the collapse of our own economies in the European Union? From Prodi onwards, you know, we've seen the policies which have been implemented destroying our industry, our SMEs, giving rise to unemployment. You know, I think that countries that survive the crisis why should they have to fork out all this money to support Ireland, which really has exercised unfair competition with its very low taxation rates against other countries? Having overcome this stress test, why do we then now see 8 billion euros of deficit? Where was Trichet? Where was he in all of this? You know, what's going to happen? Are we going to see this support package for Ireland now? What's going to happen? It's going to be declared unconstitutional from Germany? The speaker is interrupted.
Senor Borghezio, next time if you have 1 minute, you have to obey the time. That means 1 minute is 1 minute. Herr Langen, 2 Minuten. Bitte, Herr Langen.
Mr. Langen has 2 minutes. Thank you, Messrs. Presidents. I have heard much criticism directed at Deauville. But, Mr. President Van Rompuy, there were still 20 points outstanding after your last meeting of the task force, and yet you needed unanimity for a solution to be agreed. And the 2 big member states knew this. The 2 big member states who'd fallen foul of the Stability and Growth Pact in 2004. Back in 2004 there was a red-green government in Germany. So Mr. Schulz can say what he likes today, but he seems to have forgotten something. If the Stability and Growth Pact is to work, then the member states must respect its provisions. What's the point of having a legal order if it is not respected? We've got 2 council regulations and 4 regulations by council and parliament. We've got 6 pieces of legislation. We barely understand them. We're involved through the co-decision procedure, and for my group I can say we'll support the Commission and then we'll negotiate with council. That's the reality. Why don't we make the most of our powers and prerogatives as a legislator instead of merely whinging? I believe that on the 9th of May the treaty was taken virtually beyond the limit. Article 122 was used for the stability mechanism. Article 122 was not used for the mechanism. The member states didn't want it because of the powers of council and parliament. It won't be enough to change Article 136. We need a reliable legal base for the stabilization mechanism, and then everything else will fall into place.
Ferreira for 2 minutes.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. The solidarity mechanism hasn't worked. It doesn't work. Greek debt has not decreased. We have economic convulsions in Ireland and a risk of contagion. This is an intergovernmental process. I think right from the outset of the crisis we should have formatted it in a different way. The President of the Commission has just suggested a consolidation of the system. However, the third instrument that is being suggested here for our use would mean involvement of the private sector. Now, that kind of proposal, we've heard it before from Mrs. Merkel. And it was because of that statement that markets actually collapsed. It was ill-advised. The European Parliament should use its powers. We need to shoulder our responsibilities. We need to cooperate in a co-decision procedure with regard to this package on economic governance. But we can't do this whilst at the same time sacrificing quality. We can't just look at speed and not quality. Therefore, things should be clear. The European Parliament will be actively involved, but this is a very serious matter. We're talking about sovereign debt, we're talking about solutions to this problem. We can't take decisions that sideline European citizens and sideline the representatives of European citizens. We, as Europeans, need a European vision that is clear, particularly at a time of crisis. We need a European mechanism for the consolidation of sovereign debt. We need to also have a bond market, and we need to make sure that the euro is protected by European systems rather than intergovernmental systems. We should also strengthen the EU budget. We can't carry on with a 1% level. We need to make sure that we have growth and genuine convergence. They should be part of our political priorities for Europe. That's the agenda that the Commission and the new President should be defending. The President of the Commission can't just speak on behalf of the ECOFIN Council. That's something we need to explain to our European citizens. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Piotrowski. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis in the Eurozone is a fact. The situation is serious. That's why people want to amend the Treaty of Lisbon, which was so difficult to adopt in the first place. The French and German position is understandable. They don't want to pay for the crisis in Greece, Ireland and elsewhere. On the other hand, reopening the Treaty of Lisbon would be a serious precedent. It was supposed to make the EU work better. Quite obviously, it has failed. If we're forced into a treaty change, that change should affect not just the euro, but all the institutional mechanisms. Many economists say that the Greek crisis would not have happened, would not have had a European dimension if Greece had maintained its own currency. It would have had to devalue. Different currencies would create more stabilization than a single euro.
Speaker is Senor Mauro, 2 minuti, prego.
Thank you, President. I would like to make a political assessment in terms of what has been said in the course of this debate. Quite correctly, we, the members of the main European political families, I think, criticize the Eurosceptics for not believing in the euro. But I believe that the genuine problem is that maybe we don't believe in Europe. And therefore we can't blame the Eurosceptics for what is our own responsibility. We are the main European political families. We have always had major European-looking ideals, but all of the governments, which are expressions of our political families, are putting a spanner in the works to ensure that these major political projects can't be rolled out. So in so many cases, really, you know, we undo overnight what's been done during the day, which creates further responsibility for us, because if we are not in a position to guide these specific projects through our debate, from euro bonds through to other projects for the European Union, it's going to be very difficult for us to explain to our citizens that we are the same parties that back at home every day blame Europe for everything. And they say that we can only come out of the crisis if Europe cuts back on its spending. It's a fundamental principle of responsibility. And the very nature of the European project will be lost if we forget this. We will lose credibility as well, because all we're going to have, you know, is the voters fleeing the elections and empty chambers as well. We're going to lose the interest of 40% of our citizens.
To Madame Podimata for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Well, if there's one basic conclusion which comes from the last European Council, I believe it is that we haven't managed to convince the markets to get them on board. Basically, the markets nowadays have the first and the last word, so we have to ask why. Maybe because despite the tighter financial discipline rules, maybe people are understanding that we're not only not addressing this economic abyss, but it's rather being widened now. Maybe basically, we've got this group of countries which have been supported on the basis of the permanent support mechanism. Maybe people have seen that in practice, the value added of this mechanism is being undermined by sending out the wrong messages to the market. If really we so much want the private markets to be involved as well, why are we now refusing to set up a forum for exchange at European level? And why, as we tighten up financial discipline rules and we have this standing crisis management mechanism, why is there a void still which could be bridged if we looked at the setting up of a common management mechanism through a mechanism which would support us all in all of our member states? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Hübner. She has 1.5 minutes.
Chair President, to start, let me say that long-term conditions of competitiveness in individual member states will differ for years to come. Structural causes for imbalances will therefore continue to work, while economic governance will still be rather weak as a process in the making. In this context, it is of the utmost importance that the Commission, with a sense of urgency, tests with the first annual growth survey at the launch of the European semester 2011 as many elements of new economic governance as possible, in particular the scoreboard relevance and its operational ability. Second, I understand that a system of fully automatic sanctions would require a treaty change, and the proposed system can take us only as far as we can go within the confines of the treaty. That is why I trust that the Commission and the Council will do their utmost to avoid additional stages in the treatment that would unnecessarily delay the procedure. Third, the EU's economic health is not a simple sum of national situations. Additionally, as the system is based on picking up individual member states who do not behave, fixing their ill behaviour can have negative externalities. In particular, the treatment of imbalances can have an impact on other member states of the Eurozone and the rest of the Union. These potential effects should be accounted for in individual treatments so that the economic health of the Union as a whole improves. And last, I understand that a complete and in-depth impact assessment of the economic governance blueprint would require time we do not have. What helps here is that over the last 2 years the Commission has acquired substantial and in-depth knowledge and understanding of the 27 economies, so I would like to ask for 2 actions now: ensure compatibility
of you have 1.5 minutes.
And relations between internal and external imbalance.
Thank you. Colleague, let me to welcome the delegation from the European Economic Area EFTA parliaments. That means our colleagues from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, as well as the observers from the Swiss Federal Assembly in the official gallery. It's a pleasure for me to welcome this delegation to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where you will participate in the 35th EEA JPC meeting today and tomorrow. I hope that the well-established work of the EEA JPC this week will be productive and will contribute to the enhanced parliamentary cooperation as well as to ensuring of a democratic parliamentary control within the EEA. So welcome, colleagues. Now I give the floor to our next speaker, and it's Madame Van Bremt for 1.5 minutes.
Dank u, voorzitters.
Thank you, Mr. President. Messrs. Presidents, listening to the debate today, you realize that there is an issue of great importance to all the political groups. Economic governance, but there are very different views about what it should mean. Council has one interpretation. Council's conclusions concentrate unilaterally on the issues important to Council, which means cuts, cuts and cuts. This is becoming a kind of economic ideology according to which if you cut, then your economy will do well. But that's not my interpretation of economic governance, and it's not just my group that believes this. Look at The Economist, the Financial Times. These are not pink propaganda sheets. In this economic situation, it is extremely difficult to pay off your debts, but you need to be able to invest at the same time. We need not just investment, we need to increase employment. That's the way to pay off your debts. That means you have to educate people, you have to invest in reconciling work and family life, and I think if you encourage the member states to invest in that sort of thing, if you have a real economic policy vision and the tools to turn it into reality, then you'll see what economic governance can do. And I think that shows the difference between ourselves and Council.
Also 1.5 minutes.
Senhor Presidente, Senhor Presidente do Conselho, Senhor Presidente da Comissão.
Thank you, President. President of Council, sorry, and President of the Commission. The EPP position is very clear. The crisis resolution, as far as the EPP is concerned, it's a very serious crisis, a crisis for Europe. The only way to resolve this is for us to review the community method and economic governance. I think that goes without saying. We need more economic resources for Europe, we need economic governance, we need our own instruments for our genuine single currency, we need to implement this within the Eurozone. That is the only way for us to overcome the current crisis. But of course that means that every institution, Council, Commission and Parliament, every institution has to play its role and has to shoulder responsibilities vis-à-vis our European citizens, and that is something that has to be stated very clearly here. The majority of political groups in this European Parliament would be ready to cooperate with the other institutions in order to make sure that the community method is indeed applied in practice, so that we can introduce economic governance and so that we can create the right conditions for the European currency to make sure that we can fight this crisis. As things stand today, I think it's clear, unlike what's been alleged by Mrs. Ferreira or by the Socialists, I think the Commission has shown that it is not speaking for Council or speaking for Parliament. No, I think the Commission is